Estou passando nesse podcast para dividir uma informação que fez toda a diferença na minha vida. Quer fazer pós-graduação, mas tá impossível correr de um lugar para o outro?
Pois é, ainda mais com o trânsito.
Então você precisa conhecer a educação à distância do Senac. Sabia que é nota máxima no MEC? E tem diversos cursos de pós-graduação para te levar ainda mais longe. 100% online, sem necessidade de TCC e com acesso direto a todos os professores.
Ah, saber isso fez diferença sim.
Inscreva-se já na pós-graduação EAD. Quer saber? Senac EAD.
This is Salmon Wars. David, thank you so much for joining us, man.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me.
Well, I know you from the group and stuff, but if you wouldn't mind, give us a kind of a 30,000-foot view about yourself and how you came into I think a lot of people associate you with the Stop Alaskan Trawler Bycatch Facebook page, but there's so much more to this story, right? So, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I was born and raised in Homer. I went to college and did biology and teaching, so that's my degree. And then while I was in school, I started a charter boat company down in Homer, and through meeting people there, I'd ended up as the president of the Alaska Charter Association for a while, president of the Homer Charter Association. And with that, each year, we'd look at that point, it was specific to halibut allocations, so how many halibut the charter fleet could catch, and we were facing cutbacks. And there was kind of always this gorilla in the room we discovered that trawl bycatch of halibut would always come off the top. So they'd say, you guys, for an example, can catch 10 million pounds of halibut this year as all fishermen combined in Alaska, but we know that trawl's going to catch 2 million and they can't help it. So we're going to take that off the top and then split up the rest. That was always a sore subject, and people thought it was wrong, but there also wasn't a whole lot of information about it. And at the time, there was enough fish around that they could take X amount of fish off the top, and it didn't really cut us back. That was then, this is now. So now, we have big cutbacks, and the trawl bycatch in the year is 2 or 3 times what the charter sector might catch. So, and bigger picture stuff than that, subsistence salmon on the Yukon, the question of how much pollock we can pull out of the ocean, dragging nets on the bottom, etc. So,
Okay, let's back up for a minute before we get into kind of the trawling stuff. So you have I didn't actually know this. Do you have a background in biology?
yeah, so that was my degree, was as a high school biology teacher.
Huh. And so how do you make the jump from there to kind of charter boat captaining?
Well, so I'd started deckhanding on charter boats while I was in high school, starting my own business while I was in college. And kind of when I got out of college, there was this question of, do I want to teach all winter and just fish for 3 months and have that essentially to be a break-even season on expenses, or do I want to go all in on fishing and have that be, a 6-8 month commitment, which wouldn't allow me to teach. So, fishing is the direction I went. Now I have no retire.
Yeah, that's awesome. So people know you from the groups and stuff, and being that the group that you started is called Stop Alaskan Trawler Bycatch, I think we know the answer to this question already, or what you're going to say, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because it's what I'm asking everybody is, okay, would you say that Alaska has a salmon problem right now?
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty undeniable. I think most of the people have seen the press releases of the ADFG emergency orders have shut down the majority of the sport salmon fishing in the rivers, particularly charters and Homer, our daily salmon limit in most areas, or king salmon limit in most areas. We fish has been cut in half for the majority of the year. Now the Yukon River has been closed down, even for subsistence for both chum and king salmon for the last 4 years, and they're talking about another, a mandatory 7-year closure, I think, particular to the Chinook there. So, yeah, it does. But to go beyond that, I think that the North Pacific has a problem, with we're not just seeing it in salmon. So they're telling us that snow crab in the Bering Sea have starved to death. king crab in the Bering Sea have starved to death. Fur seals, whales, halibut size at age has dropped way down. Which comes back to what we kind of said at the start, is how much food or protein can we take out the lower levels of the food chain and still expect the predators on the top to do well.
So you've got a very unique, I think, view of this issue, in that you've got a biology background, you're a small business owner, you're somebody who's, trying to survive in this state. I'm sure you have bills to pay, not getting any cheaper these days to live. I can only imagine what your average gas price is down there in Homer. So, just as somebody who's a kind of a subject of the economy, right? What would you say that, let me back up for a second. So the big argument we get from big trawl and like these factory commercial fishing operations, right, is that they create thousands of jobs. They're good for the economy. They do this, they do that. You're a big numbers guy. So help the audience understand, right? Like, okay, so are these guys creating Alaskan jobs? Like, let's cut through the BS, right? Are these real Alaskan jobs? Are there real Alaskans? Like, is there a net positive benefit to the Alaskan economy from this? What does Alaska or Alaskans, what do Alaskans stand to gain from continuing to trawl versus, we know what we stand to lose, right? Like, there's, salmon are cratering in every run in the state, other than a couple of sockeye runs. And those fish are higher in the water column when they're in the deep water anyway, so they're not really subject to the trawl nets. We see, as you just stated, halibut getting closer and closer to a closure. We see, all of our deep water fish, and especially crab and stuff that Alaska's famous for, right? For years, Alaska was the deadliest catch state, and that season's all but gone now.
It's going to be a long answer. Ready for this?
You got as much time as you want to.
No, don't tell me that. So I think one of the things that a lot of people miss in the whole structure of this is that, so NOAA Fisheries regulates fisheries in Alaska more than 3 miles offshore and less than 200. So the USA owns fishing rights within 200 miles of shore. The state of Alaska only owns the right to directly regulate them within 3. Anyway, so the majority of this trawl fishing happens more than 3 miles offshore, less than 200, so it falls under the purview of federal man. But the way the feds manage that is through NOAA Fisheries, and NOAA, I guess what people don't get is that NOAA Fisheries falls underneath the umbrella of the Department of Commerce. So every time NOAA Fisheries makes a fish decision, that allocation or whatever it may be, it essentially has to be signed off on by the Secretary of Commerce. And the Secretary of Commerce's main job is to make dollars for the USA. It doesn't, maybe they do care that Alaska is losing out on it, but as long as on a global market, the USA is producing product and bringing in money, whether that money goes to Seattle or else, that's the job of the Secretary of Commerce. So the reason I think that trawl fishing exists in its current form is that it makes a lot of dollars. So a couple of years ago, they said that the value of the trawl fisheries in Alaska was $2 billion per year. But Alaska doesn't get that $2 billion. So there was a 2022 report that said that the landing tax paid to the state of Alaska off of factory trawl in particular was about $9.3 million. So I was just looking, the legislature just voted on a $12.25 billion budget for next year. If you run the numbers on that $9 million that we got from trawl landing tax would make up like 0.07% of our annual operating. So as far as taxation, Alaska's not getting much, and the preferred model for trawl, especially factory trawl, is that the fish never touches the ground in Alaska or even in the USA. So the wonder of the factory trawler is that they catch the fish, package the fish, and then they offload it at sea to vessels which typically go direct overseas. So like in the example of the Meme bottom trawl fleet, I think they put out a paper recently that said 80% of their product goes direct to China.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because you've got some numbers that say 80% going directly to China. So we joke about the McDonald's fish fillet, but it's not even going to that. Like most of this fish
Yeah,
is going straight overseas.
it is in the big picture. So, I mean, yeah, McDonald's is an easy target to have. There's a McDonald's in every town in America, and it's a household name. But in reality, these fish are being taken out of, we call them Alaskan waters, the Bering Sea for the most part, primarily to feed foreign markets. So, like wealthy Asian and European nations. And we do buy some of it back. So, that's an interesting one on, they're trying to tell the Department of Commerce that, hey, we provide all these meals for Americans, and it's so important to our food security in the U.S., but it's gone to China first, so we get back what they sell us.
Expound on that a little bit, right? Because here, pollock, generally considered a lack of a better term. I'm not trying to slander the product or anything like that to anybody who's probably chomping at the bit to sue me. But it is considered a kind of lower income food, if you will, right? I think that's a fair assumption. And the prices that they're getting for them, what is it, like 60 cents a pound at first sale, right?
9
9 cents a pound. So even lower than I thought. So tell me about how does that translate to this going to wealthier, this stuff getting offloaded to wealthier markets? Tell us about the roe, how much money they're really making off of these fish, right? Because it's not just the flesh; they're selling other parts of it as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's an important part of the conversation. So when these, pollock flesh has always been considered a super low grade food source, essentially. And so when these fisheries were originally built, that was before we had enacted this 200-mile limit within Alaska shoreline. So we had Russian trawlers, China, Japan. Anyways, foreign fleets came in, but what they really wanted was the roe, the caviar, essentially, from the pollock. And so even today, we see that as a primary driver of the fisheries. The seasons are kind of built around when the eggs are the most ripe in the fish is when they want to trawl. And just for price comparison on that, so if factory trawlers have a little bit different model because the fish never leaves their boat, so it's hard to calculate a dockside price for them. But the catcher vessels, which just go out, bring it back to the dock, and sell it in this traditional way, they get about 9 cents a pound for pollock flesh. But when a factory boat does that and brings just the eggs back, so they can separate it out on board, they get about $5.50 a pound for the roe. So there's this huge financial driver in that from the roe
sale. They get 55 times as much per pound for, I mean, more than that for the roe. But so how does that affect the tax?
Yeah, so there's an interesting caveat in Alaska landing tax structure, and this applies to all the fish. It's not just pollock. So herring roe is a big marketable item. Salmon roe is a big marketable item. But when the state of Alaska taxes a fish, it only taxes it on the value of the flesh. So say you have a 10-pound salmon you brought in, and maybe 1 pound of that salmon is the eggs, the roe. If the value of that salmon was only $1 per pound, they'd tax you on $10. But the value of the roe within that salmon might be worth $20. But that doesn't get taxed. It's just like it doesn't exist in our tax structure. And so with the smaller fisheries and less poundage, and less of a differential between the flesh price and the roe price, that can have less of an effect. But pollock statewide is pushing 4 billion pounds a year of harvest. So you're looking at millions of pounds of roe, and this 55 times the differential. So and
so that's something I think people don't understand.
Legislature issue. Yeah,
is you have these you have this view, right, in the just kind of the American imagination of like all commercial vessels kind of being equal, right? Like they think of they think every crab vessel takes in all the same amount of crab. They think that pollock, that I'm sure there are people listening to this right now that are thinking to themselves, well, why should we value the salmon fishermen over the pollock fishermen? But there's a huge difference between all these vessels and just the method in which they operate, right? So like that's why we refer to factory trawl in the amount of bycatch that they get just because of how indiscriminate the method of fishing is. But help people understand, right? Like, what is the difference between like a small seiner or like a long liner? What those guys are doing, what kind of numbers they're getting for bycatch and stuff versus like when we say factory trawl vessel, right? It's because it is the size of a factory bringing in millions of pounds of fish.
Yeah, so the biggest factory trawl I can think of in Alaska currently is about 350 feet long, so longer than a football field. And they say the boats that size can drag a net that's big enough to swallow the Eiffel Tower whole, like hold 747 jets inside the net all at once. They say the footprint of that, so how much bottom they can drag in a day, is about 6 square miles of bottom per day. Anyway, so you start to multiply that out. Most of the trawl seasons are really long. A lot of people don't get that. So the trawl season is typically closed for about the first 20 days of the year. But after that, it essentially goes off of harvest limits. So then they kind of open it up and say, hey, you guys can catch X billion pounds of fish per year. Kind of do it at your leisure. So you'll see a lot of the trawl fisheries go into December. By Christmas, they're usually starting to shut down. But anyways, so these boats might be towing, 6 square miles of seafloor per day per boat for 250 or 300 days per year. And so when you get into compared to other fisheries, like longliners, obviously anchor on bottom, they've got the lines on bottom, but the numbers just are incomparable, in essence, for that. And
sure, it's a couple feet versus a couple miles.
Yeah, a couple thousand.
Yeah.
But and you'll also hear everybody says that all fisheries have bycatch, and that's totally true. So if I took you out halibut fishing in Homer and you caught a gray cod on accident or an Irish lord, now technically speaking, that's bycatch. It's a non-target species, but you might catch one of those and you handle it. Maybe you want to keep it or throw it back, but either way, you handle it as well as you can and get it back in the water. Trawl doesn't really have that option because of the size of the operation and the volume of the fish they catch. So they, on the bigger boats, you will pull up 200,000 pounds of fish, after a 4-hour tow. And so at that point, even if they do want to throw
one more time, there's 200,000 pounds of fish in 4 hours.
Yeah, so you can be pushing 1 million pounds of fish on a boat in a 24-hour day.
And these boats don't sleep. Like, they're not on, 4-hour shifts, right? Like, these boats are out there for, periods of time, and they're just running around the clock with different crew, right?
Yeah. So you'd have, 2 captains, 2 deck crews, etc. Because you have to feed the factory on board. You can't have these, 50 people down below with no fish to package. They have to have this constant flow. Anyways, and so, where you and I might catch an Irish lord or a sculpin in a day, they might catch 10,000 pounds of bycatch in a day. And it's really hard for them to let it go because it comes up in this massive net smat, But anyways, so you can take that back down to the numbers. So over the last 10 years, trawl in Alaska, all the different trawl boats, fisheries combined, have averaged about 141 million pounds of bycatch per year. So if you break that down farther, that's 1 million pounds of waste every 2.58 days, and 1.4 billion pounds of waste every 10 years. And that's just what gets reported, and that's also after they've applied these assumed survival metrics. So like in the case of salmon, they assume that every salmon that comes on board, which was reported, died. So that one's pretty simple. But I think it's a lesser percentage on crab. And then they have this program for halibut where they can be released within about half an hour. They assume that only about 50% of them died. So that can be huge. So last year...
So much for keep them wet, right?
Yeah. Compared to a river, we're not allowed to lift a salmon out of the water.
Yeah, seriously.
Sure. But that can be huge because we're talking such huge volume. So Trawl last year reported 4.2 million pounds of halibut as bycatch, but you have to assume there was that 50% survival rate. So they actually brought on board, 8.5 million pounds of halibut, released them all, and said that But that's an oversimplification. But anyway, we're just talking big numbers. The other one that we run into pretty frequently is so the pollock fisheries will say, we're one of the cleanest fisheries in the world. We only have a 1% to 2% bycatch rate.
Yep, I was just about to ask you that.
Yeah, and that's true, but they don't add the next sentence, which is that statewide they might catch 4 billion pounds of pollock in a year. So 1% to 2% of that is suddenly 40 to 80 million pounds. And then it's like, well, what if you guys are off by another 1% to 2%? Maybe that's another 40 to 80 million.
Well, and paint the picture, right? Like, if you combine all the rest of the commercial fishing industry, right? What's that look like in comparison? Like, just raw numbers, not like playing games with percentages and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, like the bycatch. What is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
So I don't have salmon numbers memorized, but like an example that's easy for me is the South Central area charter fleet is allowed to catch, I think, 1.8 million pounds of halibut per year. That's what we keep. That's what people take home and eat. It's good for the economy, blah, blah. Versus the trawl fleet, if you add up both of the main areas statewide, is allowed to waste about 9 million. And that's 9 million pounds of mortality. So they may have caught 18 million pounds, dumped it all, and said, well, half of it survived.
So essentially 10 to 20 times the amount that you were allowed to take home and eat, they're shoveling over the side of the boats by the shovelful.
And there's another part of that. So we talk about, they haven't been hitting that 9 million pounds per year lately. So last year they had 4.2 million pounds. But there's still this big concern of, if halibut stocks are doing so poorly or salmon stocks are doing so poorly, then why is the limit still set at 9 million pounds? There's nothing to say that tomorrow they couldn't start fishing it hard and hit that, and that coming back to salmon. So most of the king salmon sport fishing in the state has been closed, but they're allowed to catch 45,000 kings as bycatch in the Bering Sea and another 32,500 kings as bycatch in the Gulf of Alaska. 77,000 kings can be caught and dumped while the rest of the state has nothing,
The numbers are staggering. I mean, it's so the commercial fishing sector, people or not just commercial fishing, but fishing in general, I would say that there's probably 4 main groups, if you will, of fishermen, right? There's the sport fishing guys, and you serve those people both as a sport fisherman yourself, but also as a sport fishing guide, right? It is a business, yes, but you're catering to guys who come up here with a dream of catching a big barn door halibut or king salmon or what have you, right? There's the subsistence guys. We know those, that the guys that are on the Kuskokwim, and I definitely said that river wrong, for which I'm very sorry, but still getting used to some of the river names up here and stuff. But you got those people who rely on that resource as their main source of protein. In many cases, right? A lot of food insecurity down in Southeast Alaska, and just to paint the picture for people, these are not villages that have easy access to a Walmart. And even if they did have easy access to a Walmart, as I said in another recording, right, we talked about the fact that food up here is just inherently more expensive, especially out in the bush, but even here in town for us, right? It's more expensive because all of our food has to get barged up here from Seattle first. And so we're paying that, and we're getting less fresh food, right? So this is a fresh, renewable source of protein, or it should be for people. But and then you have the small commercial fishermen guys. So those are the mom and pop shops that are small family boats, something of that nature. And then you have this big factory fleet that's largely based in Seattle, as I understand it, right?
Right,
Fishing Alaskan waters. So, out of the 4, I think the prevailing wisdom is really that the trawl fleet gets some special treatment. Describe some of that for us, how they get treated a little differently. I mean, I think you already touched on some of that. how they're still allowed to catch bycatch even though sport fishing for king salmon is closed statewide, right? On an iconic fish and subsistence fishing, right? Those guys on the, on the Yukon and stuff are not catching the salmon that they rely on, chums either, to feed themselves, their family, their dogs for the year. But tell us a little bit. There's more. You've told me a lot of stuff about like halibut nurseries and other stuff as well. So help educate the audience on a little bit of that stuff.
Yeah, so there's snow crab is a real easy one. So it got closed down, I think, in 2021 to all the crab fishermen. So that was one of their main incomes. So haven't quite crashed that fleet yet, but it's getting close. But for comparison, Trawl is allowed to catch 4 million individual snow crab this year as bycatch. And there again, that's one of the ones they probably won't hit, but symbolically, it's still like how, what regulatory system can say that resources crashed, nobody else can fish for them except for the guys that waste them because they can't help it. People still catch 4 million, and it's the same deal with subsistence on the Yukon. So they've been closed down for quite a few years now on chum salmon and Chinook. We already talked about the Chinook bycatch numbers in the Bering Sea. They can get 45,000 of them there. And then there's no bycatch limit at all on the chum salmon. So that's been pretty controversial. Fisheries regulators, what if we could set this infinity cap, even if it was 1 million fish per year, it would still be better than this risk that some year, a great returning was going to happen, but it got whacked by the trawl fleet. I think 2 years ago, they had 550,000 chum in that Bering Sea trawl fleet, and that really catalyzed these concerns. And not all those fish were going to go to the Yukon River, but considerable amounts, 10 to 5. Then, there's other hypocrisies. So in the Bering Sea, they have what they call the Bering Sea halibut nurseries. And that's primarily made up of small halibut. So they say the average size halibut caught them as trawl bycatch is about 4.76 pounds. And so halibut regulators have shut down these, what they designated as halibut nurseries, to all other fishermen. So you can't go there and intentionally catch halibut. But they haven't shut it down for the trawl fleet because the trawl fleet, again, accidentally catches them, So, which is just mind-blowing for a common person. But that also brings us back to why is it happening this way? And that's where you again get into like the Department of Commerce wants to see this trawl fleet make money. And with Department of Commerce regulation and NOAA fisheries, they've set up these regional councils to manage fisheries. So federal council, which we deal with in Alaska, is the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council. You'll see that abbreviated as NPFMC. And on that, there's just very loose conflict of interest rules. So these regional councils were set up by the Magnuson-Stevens Act, I think it was in 1976. And at that time, there was this acknowledgement that, hey, people fishing in Alaska don't want guys in suits in D.C. to be creating these Alaska fishing regs. They don't understand our fisheries. They've never done it. They can't be responsive. We can't wait 20 years for a regulation to come out. And so with that, they set up this kind of odd for government system of saying that we're going to let fishermen regulate fishermen. And so with that, we understand that there's going to be this conflict, this degree of conflict of interest. You can't be a fisherman and do fish rights without conflict of interest. And that was all well and good at the beginning, but now that's kind of become twisted. It's 50 years later almost. And so now most of what we see on the NPMC are like lawyers and lobbyists, and like one is a vice president for a corporation that primarily represents trawl, and I don't think any of the ones currently on there have ever made a living trawling as like people that work on the boats. They're getting a lot of them $200,000 a year to write papers and argue, and to intentionally keep trawl limits loose. And so that's where common sense has kind of got edged out of the conversation. If there's a saying amongst the NPFMC that if you ever just locked a bunch of fishermen in the room, and said, hey, you guys aren't coming out till you fix this, they could fix a lot of these issues. The halibut fishermen would say, we're going to kick them out of the trawl nurseries, and the subsistence guys are going to say, we have to have a catch on we have to have a bycatch limit on chum. And the fishermen would understand that. Alaskans would understand that. But when it's people who's, whatever CEO or whatever their position within the Trawl Corporation may be, if their salary depends on keeping bycatch limits loose, then they say, unless it's a lawsuit forcing us to do this, we're gonna write our own regs, essentially.
Which is crazy to me, right? In the light of, especially in light of, and the fact that this is such a massive conservation issue,
Right.
but also, in the light of other groups that, or other causes that are very similar in nature that get so much more airtime, right? Which is what I want to talk about next. And that you have really, so you inspired the article that I wrote for Sport Fishing Magazine that inspired this whole podcast idea. And that is just because, like, a true, I got to give you all the respect in the world, and I'm not trying to fluff you up, right? You and Jody and Caleb with Alaska Outdoor Council really started a movement, right? Using like freely available tools online. You guys don't have like seed funding, high-powered lobbyists, like I'm a former PR guy I used to make my living before getting into podcasting, setting up grassroots coalitions that would and I would have hired any one of you just based on the coalition you guys have built. Yeah, and you get cited by these professionally built like AstroTurf organizations that are like they talk about you, they name you by name, like the Midwater Trawler Cooperative or whatever it's called, and the I forget what the new one's called, but these are like AstroTurf organizations that are definitely run by PR people in another state, probably even DC, like run by professionals like my age and stuff that are like that is their salary, like you said, is to just make waves on this issue and gain support for Trawl, Team Trawl they call it and whatnot.
Yeah.
You, in a true, no pun intended, David and Goliath battle, have put together this like out of nowhere almost. Like overnight it blew up from like, I think when I joined the group it was like 10,000 people and I was impressed, and I think the last time I looked it was 25,000. Are we pushing 30 now in that group?
Yeah, it's going up on 36.
Yeah. So you're, so even higher than I thought, and you're starting to see a lot more coverage, I think, right? Like, I like to think the Sport Fishing Magazine article was one of the first ones, but you really got a big bump in viewership with, like the New York Times covered it. You were starting to see a lot more coverage of the issue. And that's largely due to your efforts because they mention, in every article they mention your group, right?
Yeah.
So like, tell us about that battle. Like, you're not a PR guy. Like, you're not some lobbyist. You're not a PR firm. You don't work at Edelman, right? Like we just said, you're a former biology teacher who runs a charter business. What was it like going from like, hey, this is affecting my home state. This is affecting the economy that my business thrives in, that my family relies on, the fish that my family rely on. How do you go from that to like building this, essentially like juggernaut in state politics? And I'm sure before long in national politics, because you're already starting to see some of that. Like, what was it like building that?
Yeah, well, I'm a little bit hard at it. So it had been frustrating when I was dealing with it a decade ago that, like I said at the start, we knew there was this issue, but there was enough fish around for everybody, so it just never came to a head. But it had always been on my mind and always bugged me, the inequality essentially of it. And so this started in COVID, people didn't have anything to do, and they'd, prior to like the initial COVID lockdown, they just released the new halibut regs, which were the most restrictive we as charters had ever had. So they said we couldn't fish for halibut on Tuesdays, couldn't fish on Wednesdays, which is close to a 30% reduction on the year. Had increased size limits, they had an annual bag limit, on and on. But at about the same time, they released the Trawl bycatch numbers, and it blew us out of the water. And so, I guess that combined with downtime is sort of what kicked it off. But really what's kept it going is that it sells itself. It's common sense. I keep saying that no one on this earth would ever be pro trawl unless they somehow benefit from it. Their employer benefits, or a family member, something else. I tell people not to just listen to me. You can Google, effects of bottom trawl, and it comes up with 100 pages of, countries have banned it outright. You can switch over the image. You can see coral that's been trawled versus coral which hasn't been trawled. 500 years ago, when we were first seeing references to it in the history books, trawl as a gear type, it was a capital offense at one point, killing people for trawling, because even then there was this understanding that you just can't drag nets over a seafloor. It's too fragile down there. Anyways, and then another big one that's pushed us is all the people coming out of the woodwork who have worked aboard trawlers. I mean, that's where probably a majority of the information comes from. And, a big frustration for me is that they shouldn't be reaching out to me, or they shouldn't have to feel that they have to reach out to me. They should be going to the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council, whose job it is to deal with this, and saying, hey, this is what I saw when I worked on the boats. It was horrible. But there's this fear, like this mafia-esque fear of, if you went to the NPFMC, you're basically testifying to the leadership of these trawl corporations, and maybe you're still a trawler, or maybe your brother is, or you live in a town where the only processor that buys your fish also has trawlers, and so there's just this crazy amount of fear, justified or not, in Alaska that people can't speak up about it.
Yeah. So okay. So I want to take a pause for a second there and dig into that, right? Because that is, help explain to people, and what you touched on it lightly, because a lot of people will see these comments and think, oh, that's just a crackpot. Like, they're afraid that, like, it's like the mafia. These people are going to Teamsters-esque, watch too much Sopranos, and they think the Teamsters are going to show up at their house and beat them up. That's really not what people are saying. What people are saying is that there's tremendous pressure on affiliated businesses, your processors and whatnot, to support trawl as well, and to toe the party line, if you will, if you'll allow me one more pun in this thing, that if they resist that, or they engage with people who are anti-trawl, it could sink not just a business but the entire town, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I mean, within Alaska, there's two big trawl towns. Kodiak is essentially the hub of the trawl fleet in South Central Alaska and the Gulf of Alaska, and then Dutch Harbor is the main hub for the Bering Sea fisheries. And so those towns, you'll see comment letters from their mayors that say, hey, we're totally dependent on trawl. You can't shut us down. But the rest of the state usually doesn't feel that way. But there are remote areas, where, so Trident gets picked on a lot, but it's a good and easy example. They're one of the main fish buyers statewide, but they're also one of the biggest trawl owners in the state, So it keeps being said to me over and over in private conversations by these fishermen that, oh my God, we can't go against Trident. They'll penalize us in some way, presumably financially. If Trident's the only fish buyer in your town and they blacklist you and say they won't buy fish from you, then you're not a fisherman anymore, or you have to eat a lot of fish just to sell it. So that is a real concern out there, and that's also come up with the crab fleet. So a lot of people say, hey, why don't the crabbers sue, or throw this big fuss? They just got shut down, and maybe Charles to blame. But the other thing that they do with crab boats is they use them as tenders in the summer to run back and forth between salmon fishermen and processors. And so now that crab has been shut down, if, say, they got blacklisted by a processor also invested in trawl and couldn't get that tender contract, then you have this $3 million boat that doesn't have any income, and if you have that much money laid out, the expenses are huge, and that's just the end. So the crabbers essentially have been crippled by that too, because they can't crab, they have to tender, but the people they'd be speaking against would be the ones that could potentially cancel their contract.
All right, so I want to so getting into this misinformation thing, right? As I said, a lot of these like AstroTurf groups that are paid for by huge corporations, they cite you directly in many of their communications, and they spend a lot of time slandering you, right? And so I want to read off some stuff and then just talk through it, right? To give you kind of a public, like on the record, a chance to push back on this stuff. So they say they deny science, they being you. This is a direct reference to you and your group on the Midwater Trawlers Cooperative Facebook page. Just 2 days ago, by the way. They believe that managers, council members, and scientists are paid off by the trawl industry. They blame trawl for everything wrong in their world, even in the face of the best available science. And they are committing libel day in and day out on their Facebook page. That's an accusation directly from the Midwater Trawler Cooperative's Facebook page just 2 days ago, which would have been April 30th, 2024. So, what would you say to the Midwater Trawler Cooperative, if I'm sure they are listening to this, but also to listeners who are like, okay, why should I believe this guy over this corporation, right?
Well, and that's where, don't believe me, that's where it comes back to, like, you can see what the group says, but at the same time, take the initiative upon yourself to Google effects of bottom trawl. This has been a nationwide 500-year issue, and it hasn't gotten the press it should have, because it happens 100 miles offshore and in 300 feet of water where nobody can see it. But if it happened onshore, it would be called stripping, it would be called clear cut. The American public has decided decades ago that that's not acceptable for us anymore. But under the water, where it can't be seen, they still go buck wild. And, that's, so I added up, there's quite a few different dedicated lobbyist trawl groups. And I went through the ones I could think of off the top of my head and looked at their annual revenue for their lobby groups, and it adds up to about $10 million a year. And that entire $10 million effort is being dumped into keeping trawl, bycatch regulations or bycatch limits high and trawl regulations loose. And they're not fishermen. They have 365 days a year to kind of dance and weave and affect regulations. So, we think we're doing a lot in Alaska, and it's this homegrown Alaskan deal, but the real effort is put in by trawl lobbyists in Washington, D.C., talking, direct to senators or the head of NOAA. So we're an annoyance in that way, and they don't appreciate the awareness. I say the irony of this is that all you have to do is make a person aware of the issues without giving them a sales pitch on, like, it should be shut down or it shouldn't be shut down. But just as soon as they know that it's happening, it's really intuitive for them to say, we don't like this. We'd vote against it if we could. We'd donate money to stop it, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where, ironically, Facebook has been so powerful, even against like this $10 million response, is as people keep hearing about it, it's an issue. And I was just on another call right before this, and I told them, when I first started into this, I set this date of, I think it's going to be, whatever. I would be happy if in 20 years, we could resolve a lot of these trawl problems. And so the group's been around for about 4 years. We've got national attention, international attention. So it's really kicked off more quickly than I expected. But I think my job in this is awareness. So there's 330 million people in the USA. They need to know that this is happening underwater. And then once they know, if they decide that they love filet fish sandwiches and they want to see it keep happening, then that's not my job, essentially, but they shouldn't be in the dark about it. It's public land under the water. It's public resource. And so once they know wherever the chips falls, they fall.
Gotcha. All right. So I thank you for your time. I got one last question that I kind of want to wrap up with. I want to, because a lot of this information is really, frankly, pretty depressing. I'm not going to lie to you. It's, and I know that you're no stranger to that feeling, right? But I do want to leave people with a sense of what can be done, right? We're trying to push back against defeatism with this. We're trying to find solutions with this investigative series. So if you were, wave a magic wand, right? Like someone owed you a favor on the floor of the Senate and, you could make 5 policy-making decisions today, up to 5. You don't have to name 5 if you don't have any. In your view, that would help fix or mitigate the problem over the long haul, right? That would restore the salmon runs. What would be the 5 decisions you would make today that would restore these fish?
So I've been talking about trawl the whole time, so I'll stick to that vein, I guess. But you have to have bycatch limits on salmon that are reflective of the salmon populations. So in the Bering Sea, there's 2 king salmon limits. So they say when king salmon stocks are high, they can get 60,000 a year as bycatch, and when king salmon are low, you can get 45,000 a year as bycatch. But there's no addendum in there for what about king salmon have crashed completely. Maybe it should be 1,000 at that point. They don't do that. There's some pretty considerable observer issues. So especially in the Gulf of Alaska, the bottom trawl catcher fleet in the Gulf of Alaska is only required to bring an observer along for about 15% of their trips. So that means that 85% of the time, their numbers are essentially assumed, their bycatch numbers, which mathematically and biologically is a disaster. You can't take 15% of the time and assume that what you saw in that instance happens the other 85% of the time, especially if there's a financial incentive for crew to deceive the observer. We've had stories about the captain, when the observer is on board, since it's so little of the whole season, they fish where they'd never fish on purpose, or they set the net in before midnight and then set the net in again after midnight and say that they had an observer along for 2 days. That, Alaska's smarter than that, and NOAA Fisheries is smarter than that. I don't know how NAMA too. But the another big one is that if you look up, there's this conversation about whether or not pollock should be listed as a forage fish. So if you start looking through food sources for a bunch of these, like marine mammals and salmon and everything else,
on the East Coast.
Correct. Yeah. Pollock is a huge lower level portion of the Alaska food chain, and we have all these animals starving to death in Alaska. But at the same time, we're pulling close to 4 billion pounds out of the water, and we have this. We don't know whether climate change is pushing that hard or pushing a little bit or not at all. But no matter where you stand on that issue, there's still this knowledge that, hey, maybe we should pull back some of our harvests if animals are starving to death, climate's changing. Maybe it's time to not do billions of pounds of fish anymore. Another big one, and it's not as particular to salmon, is there's this issue with midwater trawl versus bottom trawl. So there's worldwide, there's been a lot of concern about the impact of bottom trawls mowing down habitat underwater. Much of the North Pacific waters have been banned to bottom trawl. There's a king crab savings area in the Bering Sea, which is banned to bottom trawl. So everybody knew how bad it was. Kills the fish, kills the crab, kills the habitat. Maybe this takes 200 years to regrow. We got to ban it. But what they didn't ban was midwater trawl. And going beyond that, there's really no legal definition of what a midwater trawl is, and there's no regulation that a midwater trawl has to stay off bottom. So this came up with the crab crash a couple of years ago. King crab and snow crab had just crashed, and the NPFMC put out this report that said, well, actually, we looked through our data, and these trawl captains told us that 40 to 90 or 40 to 100% of the time, depending on what boat they're fishing on and what season, their nets are dragging bottom. So now you have these midwater midwater trawl nets, which drag bottoms in areas close to bottom trawl. This has been brought up with NOAA Fisheries, but there again, for them to change that reg, it would have to go through the NPFMC, and the NPFMC is heavily weighted with trawl interests, so they're effective at essentially stilling. And the list goes on.
Sure.
Yeah, sorry, and really the biggest thing, there's just so much common sense. Like we said before, if you put 30 fishermen in the room, lock the door, they could say, hey, we're not going to put midwater trawls on bottom. Hey, we're going to close the halibut nursery. We're going to put a catch on, or put a limit on chum bycatch. We're going to put 100% observer coverage in the Gulf of Alaska. They're just fundamental, intelligent decisions that shouldn't be hard to make, and that's why the group has grown so fast. As people have known about this, or once they hear about it, it's like, well, how much political money is getting thrown around to keep these regs so artificially loose?
All right. Well, David, thank you so much, man. I appreciate you taking the time. Real quick, so we've mentioned it a couple times. I want to make sure we take a plug to the Facebook page, Stop Alaskan Trawler Bycatch. You will find that, listeners, a link to that in the show notes. But beyond that, if they want to get a hold of you, if they want to support the efforts that you're doing, how do people find that effort? Do you guys have a C3, C4, or anything of that nature that's raising money on this front?
No, so we don't have any formal organization. But there are some sidebar organizations. Well, they're not sidebar, but we're not technically affiliated with them. But right now there's a lawsuit going around. It's essentially an intervening lawsuit to an issue with halibut bottom trawl in the Bering Sea. So people can donate money to that. And then beyond that, the best way to get a hold of us, I guess, is to just post a question on the Facebook page. There's another kind of caveat on there. So that Facebook page has become this big melting pot. Trawl and trawl bycatch is really interesting because it's not a Republican issue. It's not Democrat. It's not Alaskan. It's not a state. And so within that, we get in this interesting management dynamic where we have all these groups, which in any other issue in society would all separate out and kind of talk in their own echo chambers. They're all in there duking it out, which keeps it strong, keeps it growing. But anyways, for new people, don't be dissuaded if you see something you don't like. We'll do the best.
Yeah, no, I was shocked. I mean, even politically speaking, transparently, I'm pretty sure you and I stand pretty far apart as far as party lines standpoint and stuff. But I mean, the group, like you said, really does transcend those lines. It's just people who, they're coming there because they care about the fish, and these are iconic fish, you could say the fish are Republican red, but they're, the ocean's Democrat blue. That's, that's the beauty, I thought, of the group itself was just how wide the interest groups were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and that's how it should be. I mean, this shouldn't be a one versus the other issue. It's too simple for that. You're too
Awesome.
talented.
All right. Thank you, David. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks.